Before the first star ignited in the cosmic dark, before galaxies began their ancient dance across the void, there existed something extraordinary. Not a force we can measure, not energy we can detect with our instruments, but the Word itself, the creative principle through which all existence would spring forth like wildflowers after rain. Consider for a moment the magnitude of what we are contemplating. Everything you have ever touched, every breath you have drawn, every photon of light that has ever reached your eyes, all of it emerged from this primordial word. The atoms in your body, forged in the nuclear furnaces of dying stars, and the very consciousness with which you perceive these words, all of it traces back to this singular, eternal source. And then, in what must rank as the most audacious moment in the history of the universe, this infinite word chose to compress itself into human form. Imagine, if you will, the entire ocean deciding to flow through a single stream, or the sun focusing all its radiance through a dewdrop. The comparison falls woefully short, yet it begins to capture the wonder of what we call the Incarnation. The setting is almost absurdly humble. Not Rome, with its marble temples and imperial grandeur. Not Athens, where philosophy echoed through porticoed halls. But Nazareth, a village so unremarkable that its very name would later prompt the dismissive question, can anything good come from Nazareth? Here, in this dusty corner of Palestine under Roman occupation, where olive trees clung to limestone hills and shepherds still watched their flocks by night, the cosmic became local. Mary, a young woman perhaps 14 or 15 years old, betrothed to a carpenter named Joseph, carries within her womb the architect of the universe. The irony is breathtaking. The hands that shaped nebulae now grow as tiny fists beneath a human heart. The voice that commanded light into existence develops as cells divide and multiply in the ancient rhythm of human gestation. But we must travel forward 30 years to witness the moment when this extraordinary reality breaks upon human consciousness like dawn after the longest night. An old man stands in the waters of the Jordan River, his weathered hands steady despite the current's pull. John, called the Baptist, cuts a striking figure, camel hair clothing rough against his sun-darkened skin, sustained by locusts and wild honey, the diet of one who has made the wilderness his home. John's very appearance speaks of preparation, of making ready. In the harsh beauty of the Judean desert, where survival depends on stripping away everything unnecessary, he has become a living symbol of the coming kingdom. His is not the refined message of the synagogue or the political rhetoric of the zealots, but something far more radical, the announcement that heaven itself is about to intersect with earth. People stream to him from Jerusalem and all Judea, drawn by something they cannot quite name. In the ancient ritual of baptism, immersion in living water, they find cleansing, yes, but more than that, they find preparation for something unprecedented. John baptizes them in the Jordan, the same river where Naaman the Syrian was cleansed of leprosy, where Joshua led Israel into the promised land. History echoes in these waters, but something entirely new is about to unfold. Then, on a day that begins like any other, Jesus of Nazareth walks down to the river's edge. Picture the moment, the creator of water molecules approaching the waters he designed, the one who set the hydrological cycle in motion, requesting baptism from his own creation. John recognizes the profound reversal this represents. "I need to be baptized by you," he protests, "and do you come to me?" But Jesus insists, "Let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." And so the sinless one submits to a ritual of repentance, not because he needs cleansing, but because he has come to stand with humanity in all its need. The water closes over the head that holds all wisdom. The Jordan receives the one who spoke oceans into existence. And then observe carefully what happens next as Jesus rises from the water. The heavens open, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but actually open, as if the sky were a scroll being unrolled. The word used in the original Greek suggests a violent tearing, like fabric ripped apart. The barrier between heaven and earth, in place since Eden's gates were barred, suddenly gives way. Descending like a dove, gentle yet unmistakable, the Spirit of God becomes visible. The same Spirit that hovered over the primordial waters in Genesis now hovers over these waters in recognition. In this moment, the Trinity reveals itself in perfect clarity. The Son rising from the water, the Spirit descending like a dove, and the Father's voice echoing from heaven. That voice, imagine standing close enough to hear it, not the distant rumble of thunder, but words spoken with the same authority that called galaxies into being. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." These words carry the weight of eternity, the approval of perfection, recognizing perfection, love acknowledging love in its purest form. The Baptist, who had leaped in his mother's womb at Mary's approach 30 years earlier, now witnesses the fulfillment of that prenatal prophecy. This is the one he was born to announce, the one whose sandals he is not worthy to untie. Standing in the muddy waters of the Jordan, John becomes the first human being to see the Word made flesh revealed in all his glory. But consider the profound irony of this moment. The one who needs no cleansing submits to cleansing. The one who baptizes with the Holy Spirit and fire first receives baptism with water. The eternal enters time, the infinite embraces limitation. The Word that was with God and was God now speaks from human lips the most human of all words. Yes, it is here, in these waters, that Jesus' public ministry begins. Not in a palace or temple, not with fanfare and royal proclamation, but in a river where ordinary people come seeking God. The cosmic has indeed become local, but even more wonderfully, the local has become cosmic. This muddy river in an obscure province becomes the stage for the greatest revelation in human history. From this moment forward, everything changes. The long silence between heaven and earth is broken. The Word that existed before time has entered time, and nothing will ever be the same. The one who emerged from these waters dripping with river water and heaven's approval will soon begin to demonstrate what it means for the divine to dwell among us. The Gospel writer John, reflecting on these events 60 years later from his exile on the rocky island of Patmos, would capture the magnitude of this moment in words that have echoed through 20 centuries. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. That glory, first glimpsed in the opened heavens above the Jordan, would soon manifest itself in ways that would astonish the world. The one who rose from baptismal waters would shortly turn water into wine, calm storms with a word, and ultimately pass through death itself as easily as he had passed through the Jordan's current. But for now, in this moment of dripping revelation beside the ancient river, it is enough to stand in wonder. The Word has become flesh, heaven has opened, and the greatest story ever told has truly begun. 3 days. In the cosmic scale of things, 3 days is nothing less than a heartbeat in the life of a star, a whisper in the wind of geological time. Yet sometimes, the most profound transformations occur not across eons, but in moments so brief they can slip past unnoticed by all but the most attentive observers. 3 days after Jesus called his first disciples, fishermen who left their nets still dripping with the waters of Galilee, he attended a wedding in Cana. Picture this small village nestled in the hills of Galilee, its white limestone houses catching the late afternoon sun like scattered pearls. Wedding celebrations in first-century Palestine were not mere afternoon affairs, but week-long festivals that bound communities together with joy, food, and wine. But on this particular day, in this unremarkable village, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The wine, that ancient symbol of joy and celebration, had run out. In a culture where hospitality was sacred and honor everything, this was no mere inconvenience. It was social catastrophe. The bridegroom's family faced public humiliation that would echo through generations. Mary, the mother of Jesus, approached her son with the quiet confidence of one who had pondered many mysteries. In her heart, her words were simple. They have no wine, no request, no demand, just a statement of need presented to the one she knew could meet it. When Jesus initially hesitated, suggesting his time had not yet come, Mary turned to the servants with words that have echoed through 20 centuries. Do whatever he tells you. Consider what happened next. 6 stone water jars stood nearby, each capable of holding 20 to 30 gallons, massive vessels used for Jewish purification rituals. These were not decorative containers, but working tools of religious observance, filled with water for the washing of hands and ceremonial cleansing that marked the rhythm of devout life. Jesus instructed the servants to fill these jars to the brim. Imagine the sound of water cascading into stone, the servants wondering at this strange request even as they obeyed. 150 gallons of water, drawn from the village well, carried in clay pitchers, poured with the methodical care of those accustomed to following orders without understanding their purpose. Now draw some out, Jesus commanded, and take it to the master of the feast. Picture the moment when the first servant dipped his ladle into what had been, moments before, ordinary water. The liquid that emerged was wine, not just any wine, but wine of extraordinary quality, rich with the complexity that normally requires months or years of fermentation. The transformation was complete, instantaneous, and absolute. Hydrogen and oxygen atoms, arranged moments before in the simple structure of water, had somehow been reorganized into the complex organic compounds that create wine's distinctive character. Sugars that had never existed in grapes, tannins that had never aged in wooden casks, esters that had never developed through fermentation, all present in perfect proportion and harmony. The master of the feast, tasting this impossible vintage, called the bridegroom aside with words that revealed his puces alti, amazement. Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. He spoke more truth than he knew. The creator of grapes and the designer of fermentation had indeed saved the best for last. But this was merely the beginning. From Cana's celebration to Capernaum's desperation, where a royal official, likely a member of Herod's court, faced every parent's worst nightmare. His son lay burning with fever in the coastal city of Capernaum, some 25 miles away. The journey from Capernaum to Cana would have taken the better part of a day, travelling on foot or by donkey along the dusty roads that connected Galilee's scattered communities. Imagine this desperate father, a man accustomed to power and authority, now reduced to pleading with an itinerant teacher. His son, perhaps his only heir, certainly his beloved child, tossed in delirium as fever consumed his small body. The medical knowledge of the time offered little hope. Childhood fevers often ended in death, leaving parents to mourn what might have been. "Sir, come down before my child dies," the official pleaded, his words carrying the weight of a father's anguish. But Jesus responded in a way that must have seemed almost cruel. "Go, your son will live." No journey to Capernaum, no laying on of hands, no elaborate ritual, just 7 words spoken with quiet authority. The official faced a choice that would define everything. He could demand that Jesus accompany him, insist on visible proof, require tangible evidence. Instead, he chose something far more difficult. He believed the word he had heard. Turning away from the teacher, he began the long journey home, carrying nothing but a promise that defied logic. As he travelled, something extraordinary was happening 25 miles away. At the 7th hour, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, The precise moment Jesus spoke, his words of healing, the fever broke. The child's burning skin began to cool, his labored breathing eased, his wild eyes focused with returning consciousness. The servants of the household, who had been preparing for mourning, found themselves witnessing recovery instead. When the official met his servants the next day, still some distance from home, their news confirmed what faith had already accepted. Your son lives. The fever had left at exactly the hour Jesus had spoken. Space had collapsed before the authority of divine word. Healing had travelled faster than light itself. But it was in Jerusalem, during one of the great feast days when the city swelled with pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world, that perhaps the most poignant of these early signs occurred. Near the sheep gate, there existed a pool called Bethesda, House of Mercy, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades that provided shelter for the sick and desperate. Among the crowds of sufferers lay a man who had been an invalid for 38 years. 38 years longer than many lived in that harsh era, longer than entire empires sometimes endured. For 38 years, he had watched the seasons change, had seen healthy people walk past his mat, had heard the laughter of children who would grow to adulthood while he remained trapped in his broken body. Local tradition held that an angel periodically troubled the waters of the pool, and whoever stepped in first after the disturbance would be healed. Whether this belief reflected supernatural reality or natural phenomenon mattered little to those who had nowhere else to turn. Hope, however slim, was all many possessed. When Jesus saw this man and learned that he had been there for such a long time, he asked a question that penetrated to the heart of human existence. Do you want to be healed? It seems an obvious question. Who wouldn't want healing? Yet it carried depths that the invalid himself seemed to recognize. His answer revealed the complex psychology of long-term suffering. Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred, and while I am going, another steps down before me. Notice what Jesus did next. No pool, no waiting for troubling waters, no competition with others for divine favor. Simply the words, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." The command was as impossible as it was clear. Muscles that had not borne weight for nearly 4 decades suddenly surged with strength. Tendons that had contracted from disuse stretched and responded. Neurons fired in patterns long forgotten, sending signals of movement and coordination through pathways that had been dormant for a lifetime. The man rose. He picked up his mat, the simple pallet that had been both bed and boundary for 38 years, and he walked. Not with the tentative steps of one testing uncertain legs, but with the confident stride of one made whole. The healing was complete, instantaneous, and absolutely undeniable. Yet this miraculous restoration would soon generate fierce opposition, for it occurred on the Sabbath. The religious authorities, guardians of tradition and interpreters of law, saw not mercy but violation. In their intricate system of Sabbath regulations, carrying one's mat constituted work, and work on the Sabbath was forbidden. The healed man found himself caught between old rules and new reality, between institutional authority and personal transformation. These 3 signs, water to wine, healing across distance, restoration after decades, represented just the beginning. They were like the first notes of a symphony, hints of the magnificent composition to come. Each revealed something profound about the nature of the one who performed them. His mastery over matter, his transcendence of space and time, his compassion for human suffering. But they also revealed something about the nature of faith itself. The servants at Cana, who filled the jars with water, the royal official who travelled home with only a word of promise, the invalid who obeyed an impossible command, each discovered that miracles often require human participation, that divine power frequently operates through ordinary obedience. As word of these extraordinary events spread throughout Galilee and beyond, crowds began to gather wherever Jesus appeared. Some came seeking healing, others driven by curiosity, still others hoping to witness the impossible made manifest. The one who had emerged from the Jordan's waters was demonstrating that the boundaries between heaven and earth had indeed been forever altered. Yet even these remarkable signs were but previews of greater wonders to come. The Word made flesh had much more to reveal about the nature of divine love and the scope of divine power. What had begun with water transformed to wine would culminate in death transformed to life. But that story lay ahead, waiting to unfold in its appointed time. Opposition, like salt crystallizing from an evaporating sea, began to form around the extraordinary events that marked Jesus' early ministry. The healing at Bethesda, performed on the Sabbath, had shattered more than just one man's paralysis. It had fractured the careful equilibrium between religious tradition and divine intervention. Picture the religious authorities of Jerusalem, men who had dedicated their lives to preserving the sacred traditions handed down through generations. They were not cruel men, nor were they ignorant. They were scholars, deeply versed in Scripture, guardians of a faith that had survived exile and occupation, persecution and pressure. Yet when confronted with healing that violated their understanding of proper Sabbath observance, they reacted with the predictability of a chemical reaction, fury mixing with fear to produce something toxic. Their anger compounded exponentially when Jesus, questioned about his authority to command Sabbath healing, responded with words that shook the very foundations of their theological world. "My Father is working until now, and I am working." The implications were staggering. Not only did he claim to act with divine authority, but he called God his own Father in a way that suggested equality, not mere adoption. The charge of blasphemy hung in the air like dust before a desert storm. In their legal system, blasphemy merited death by stoning, a brutal but decisive response to what they perceived as ultimate sacrilege. Yet something held them back. Some recognition, perhaps, that this man was unlike any they had encountered before. As tensions mounted in Jerusalem, Jesus continued his ministry throughout Galilee and beyond, and it was during one of the great feast seasons that perhaps the most dramatic of his early confrontations occurred. The Feast of Tabernacles. Sukkot was a time of celebration and remembrance, when Jewish families built temporary shelters to commemorate their ancestors' wilderness wanderings and to give thanks for the harvest. During this feast, an ancient ritual played out each day in the temple courts. Priests would draw water from the pool of Siloam in golden vessels, carrying it in solemn procession up the Temple Mount while the crowds chanted psalms of thanksgiving. This water would then be poured out on the altar as the people remembered God's provision in the desert, when water flowed from a rock at Moses' command. It was on the last and greatest day of this feast, as the water was being poured and the ancient words of remembrance were being spoken, that Jesus suddenly stood up in the midst of the gathered thousands. Picture the scene. The temple courts packed with pilgrims from across the known world, the ritual reaching its crescendo, and then a voice cutting through the ceremonial murmur with startling clarity and power. "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the Scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." The timing was breathtaking, theatrical in eye, the most divine sense. As priests poured out water that would soon evaporate under the Palestinian sun, Jesus offered water that would never run dry. As the people remembered provision that had sustained their ancestors for 40 years in the desert, he offered provision that would sustain them for eternity. The crowd erupted in division. Some declared him to be the prophet whom Moses had promised would come. Others proclaimed him the Messiah, the long-awaited deliverer. Still others questioned his credentials, pointing out that he came from Galilee rather than Bethlehem, the city of David where prophecy said the Christ would be born. They spoke more truth than they knew. Jesus had indeed been born in Bethlehem, though he had been raised in Nazareth. The religious authorities, alarmed by the growing enthusiasm, sent temple guards to arrest him. But when these officers returned empty-handed, their superiors demanded an explanation. The guards' response revealed the problem they faced. No one ever spoke like this man. Even trained law enforcement found themselves unable to act against someone whose words carried authority they had never encountered before. It was during this time of rising tension that one of the most powerful and controversial encounters in Jesus' ministry took place. The story is so challenging that some ancient manuscripts omit it entirely, perhaps because scribes feared its implications for their understanding of divine justice and mercy. Early one morning, as Jesus taught in the temple courts, religious leaders dragged a woman before him, a woman caught in the very act of adultery. Picture her shame, her terror, her certain knowledge that death awaited. Under Jewish law, adultery was punishable by stoning, a brutal execution that served both as punishment and public deterrent. But notice the cruel calculation behind this confrontation. Where was the man? Adultery requires two participants, yet only the woman faced judgment. It was not about justice. It was about creating an impossible dilemma for Jesus. If he said to stone her, he would violate Roman law, which reserved the right of execution to imperial authorities. If he said to release her, he would appear to contradict the law of Moses. The stones were already in their hands, warmed by angry palms eager to cast the first blow. The trap seemed perfect, inescapable. Yet Jesus did something that no one expected. He bent down and began writing in the dust of the temple courtyard. What did he write? The text doesn't tell us, leaving 20 centuries of readers to wonder. Perhaps he wrote the names of the accusers. Perhaps he wrote their own hidden sins. Perhaps he simply wrote the word mercy over and over until its meaning sank into hearts hardened by self-righteousness. Or perhaps he wrote the names of other women these men had used and discarded, a silent reminder of their own complicity in the very sin they now condemned. When they continued, pressing him for an answer, Jesus straightened up and spoke words that have echoed through history. "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he bent down again and continued writing, allowing his words to penetrate hearts and consciences. The response was as beautiful as it was inevitable. The sound of stones dropping first one, then another, then a cascade of abandoned weapons hitting the ground. Beginning with the eldest, who had lived long enough to know their own failures, the accusers melted away until Jesus and the woman stood alone in the vast temple courtyard. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord." "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." Here was justice and mercy, embracing, law and grace dancing together in perfect harmony. The woman was not condemned, but neither was her sin ignored. She was forgiven, but also called to transformation. This was the new way Jesus embodied, not the destruction of law, but its fulfillment in love. Yet even as Jesus demonstrated this radical grace, opposition continued to crystallize. The religious establishment, feeling their authority threatened, began to plot more seriously against him. His growing popularity among the common people only heightened their concern. They were guardians of order, and this man seemed to be turning their carefully maintained world upside down. Meanwhile, Jesus continued to teach and heal, his words offering hope to those who had never known it, and his touch bringing restoration to bodies and lives broken by the harsh realities of first-century existence. He spoke of himself as the light of the world, the bread of life, the Good Shepherd, images that resonated deeply with people whose daily existence was marked by darkness, hunger, and danger. But it was his claim to be living water that perhaps struck deepest into the human condition. Water, after all, is not luxury but necessity. Without it, life simply cannot exist. In a land where droughts could spell disaster, and where every drop was precious, the promise of water that would never run dry spoke to the deepest human longings. This living water, Jesus explained, was not like the water drawn from wells that would leave people thirsty again. This was water that would become in those who received it a spring welling up to eternal life. It was provision not just for the body, but for the soul itself, that mysterious center of human existence that yearns for something beyond the material, something that transcends the boundaries of time and mortality. As word of these teachings spread, carried by traders along ancient routes and by pilgrims returning to distant homes, the impact rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped into still water. In synagogues across the Mediterranean world, in Jewish communities from Alexandria to Rome, people began to hear reports of a teacher unlike any other, one who claimed not just to know the way to God, but to be the way itself. The stage was being set for confrontations that would ultimately determine not just Jesus' fate, but the course of human history. Forces were aligning, opposition was hardening, and the one who offered living water was walking steadily toward a confrontation with the powers of this world that would test every claim he had made and every promise he had offered. But for now, the ministry continued, the signs multiplied, and the living water flowed to all who were willing to receive it. In desert places, both literal and metaphorical, hope was taking root and beginning to bloom in ways that would transform not just individual lives, but the world itself. 6 days before Passover, in the small village of Bethany, where grief had recently turned to joy when Lazarus walked from his tomb, something extraordinary happened that would illuminate the approaching darkness. The house belonged to the siblings Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, dear friends, who had opened their home to Jesus many times before. But on this evening, the atmosphere carried an intensity that none of them could quite name. Picture Mary, the contemplative sister who had once sat at Jesus' feet while Martha worried about dinner preparations. In her hands she held an alabaster jar, a sealed vessel containing pure nard, an aromatic oil more precious than gold. This spikenard had likely been imported from the distant Himalayas, carried along trade routes that connected India to the Mediterranean world. Its value was staggering. 300 denarii, equivalent to a full year's wages for a common labourer. Without warning, without explanation, Mary broke the jar. The crack of alabaster splitting echoed through the house like a prophecy of things to come. The precious oil enough to anoint a king flowed over Jesus' feet in an act of devotion so extravagant it took everyone's breath away. The fragrance filled the entire house, a scent so rich and powerful that it would linger in memory long after it had faded from the air. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Judas Iscariot, the group's treasurer, calculated the loss with the precision of a money changer. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? His words carried the ring of righteousness, the sound of fiscal responsibility. Yet John, writing decades later, would note that Judas said this not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief who regularly helped himself to the group's common purse. But Jesus saw something different in Mary's action. While others calculated waste, he recognized wisdom. While others saw extravagance, he saw preparation. "Leave her alone," he said, defending this act of love against the criticism of pragmatism. "She has kept this for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning that would only become clear in the days ahead. Mary, in her intuitive understanding, had done what the disciples' theology had not yet prepared them to do. She had anointed her Lord for burial while he was still alive to receive it. Her broken alabaster jar became a prophecy in perfume, a recognition that love sometimes expresses itself most beautifully in what the world considers waste. As the week progressed, the atmosphere in Jerusalem grew increasingly charged. Passover was approaching, that great feast when the city's population swelled from perhaps 60,000 to over 200,000 pilgrims. Every house, every courtyard, Every available space filled with families who had traveled from across the Roman Empire to celebrate their ancestors' deliverance from Egyptian bondage. The irony was palpable. As Jews gathered to remember their liberation from one empire, they lived under the occupation of another. Roman legions maintained order with steel and stone, while Jewish leaders walked the delicate tightrope between preserving their authority and avoiding imperial wrath. Into this volatile mixture came Jesus, riding a donkey through crowds shouting, "Hosanna," a Hebrew word meaning "save now," that carried unmistakable political overtones. The triumphal entry had rattled the authorities. The raising of Lazarus, just miles from Jerusalem, had convinced them that decisive action was necessary. The high priest Caiaphas had spoken words that he intended as political calculation, but that carried prophetic weight. It is better that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation should perish. And so, in an upper room rented in secrecy, Jesus gathered with his 12 disciples for what would be their final meal together. The room had been prepared according to his specific instructions, furnished with the low couches arranged around the perimeter that was customary for formal dining. As evening shadows lengthened and oil lamps began to flicker, the most significant meal in human history was about to begin. But before they reclined to eat, Jesus did something that shocked everyone present. He rose from his place, removed his outer garments, and tied a towel around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, the task of the lowest household slave, the job that even Jewish servants were not required to perform. Picture Peter's reaction when Jesus knelt before him with the basin. This was the man who had declared Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, now reduced to stammering protests. "Lord, do you wash my feet?" When Jesus explained that Peter would understand later, the fisherman's response was characteristic in its vehemence. "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus' reply cut to the heart of discipleship itself. "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Faced with the prospect of separation from his Lord, Peter swung to the opposite extreme. "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." The exchange was both touching and prophetic within hours. This same impetuous disciple would deny knowing Jesus at all. When the foot washing was complete and Jesus had resumed his place at the table, he explained what had just occurred. "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you." In a world obsessed with hierarchy and honor, Jesus was modeling a leadership that would revolutionize human relationships. Authority, expressed through service, greatness measured by humility. As the meal progressed, Jesus took bread, the simple barley loaves that were staples of Palestinian diet, and after giving thanks, he broke it with words that transformed its meaning forever. "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The bread that had sustained countless meals suddenly became a symbol of sacrifice, a preview of the breaking that was to come. Then he took the cup of wine, the fruit of vines that had grown under Palestinian sun and been tended by human hands, and invested it with new significance. "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." The wine that had brought joy to wedding celebrations and sealed business transactions now became the seal of a new relationship between heaven, earth, purchased with the most precious currency imaginable. In the midst of these sacred moments, Jesus spoke words that cast a shadow over the entire gathering. "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another in confusion and dismay, each one wondering, "Is it I?" The thought that one of their number could be capable of such treachery seemed impossible, yet their Lord's words carried the weight of certainty. When John, leaning close to Jesus, asked for the identity of the betrayer, Jesus replied, "It is." he to whom I will give this morsel after I have dipped it." The piece of bread, soaked in the bitter herbs that commemorated their ancestors' suffering in Egypt, became itself a bitter sign. When Jesus gave it to Judas, something dark passed between them, not just bread, but destiny. "What you are going to do quickly," Jesus said, and Judas rose and walked out into the night. John's simple phrase carries profound weight, and it was night, not merely an indication of time, but a description of what was descending upon the world. The light of the world was about to be extinguished, and darkness was gathering its forces for what would seem like final victory. With Judas gone, Jesus spoke for hours in what would be his longest recorded discourse. His words poured out like water from a broken vessel, promises of the Holy Spirit's coming, explanations of his relationship with the Father, assurances of divine love that would never fail. He spoke of a time when they would understand what now seemed impossible, when joy would replace their sorrow, when they would see him again and their hearts would rejoice. "In the world you will have tribulation," he told them as the night deepened around them, "but take heart, I have overcome the world." The words would prove prophetic in ways they could not imagine. The one who spoke of overcoming was walking steadily toward what would appear to be the greatest defeat in human history. As the discourse ended, Jesus led them out of the city, across the Kidron Valley where David had once fled from his own son's betrayal, to a garden called Gethsemane, a name meaning oil press. How fitting that the one who would be crushed for humanity's sins should spend his final free hours in a place whose very name spoke of pressure, extraction. While the disciples settled in to wait, Jesus withdrew a stone's throw away to pray. The words that Luke recorded would reveal the full humanity of the one they called Lord. "Father, if they are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours, be done." The struggle was real, the anguish genuine. Sweat fell from his brow, like drops of blood, a rare medical condition called hematidrosis, triggered by extreme psychological stress. An angel appeared to strengthen him, yet the battle continued. This was no mere human facing death, but the sinless Son of God, contemplating the weight of all human sin pressing down upon him. The cup he would drink was filled not just with physical suffering, but with spiritual anguish beyond human comprehension, the experience of separation from the Father who had been his constant companion throughout eternity. When he returned to the disciples, he found them sleeping, overcome not by indifference, but by exhaustion and grief they could not understand. "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation," he urged them. But human flesh proved weak even when the spirit was willing. Then came the moment that would split history in two. Torches pierced the garden's darkness, carried by a cohort of Roman soldiers and temple guards. Leading them was Judas, armed not with weapons but with the most devastating weapon of all, a kiss of betrayal. "Greetings, Rabbi," he said, and pressed his lips to the cheek of the one he was selling for 30 pieces of silver. "Friend," Jesus replied, "why are you here?" Even in betrayal, he offered grace. Even in arrest, he maintained dignity. When the crowd moved forward to seize him, Jesus asked a simple question. "Whom do you seek?" Their answer, "Jesus of Nazareth," prompted a response that literally knocked them to the ground. "I am he." The Greek phrase, ego eimi, was the same used in the Greek translation of Exodus when God revealed his name to Moses. "I am, who I am." Peter, true to form, drew his sword and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. But Jesus, even as he was being arrested, paused to heal the wounded man, his final miracle before the cross, an act of mercy toward those who had come to destroy him. "Put your sword back into its place," he told Peter, For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? 12 legions, 72,000 angels stood ready at his command. The power that had created the universe remained at his disposal. Yet he chose submission over force, love over might, the cross over the crown. The disciples, not understanding this cosmic strategy, scattered like sheep before wolves, fulfilling the prophecy Jesus had quoted earlier. I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. As the torches disappeared into the night, carrying their captive toward a trial that would mock justice and a cross that would redefine victory, the garden fell silent. The oil press of Gethsemane had done its work. The one who would be crushed for human transgression had surrendered himself to the crushing. Night had indeed fallen, darker than any the world had ever known. But those who understood the deeper rhythms of divine love knew that the darkest hour comes just before dawn, and dawn, though they could not yet see it, was already on its way. The trials began in darkness and proceeded through the night like a judicial nightmare, each stage revealing more clearly the collision between human systems and divine purpose. They were illegal by Jewish law. No capital cases were supposed to be tried at night, no verdicts were to be rendered on the same day testimony was heard, and the required waiting period between sessions was ignored entirely. Yet they were expedient by Roman standards, a careful dance between imperial authority and local religious concerns. Picture the scene as Jesus was first brought before Annas, the former high priest who still wielded enormous power behind the scenes of Jewish politics. Though officially replaced by his son-in-law Caiaphas, Annas remained the true patriarch of the priestly establishment, a man who had held ultimate religious authority for over 2 decades and was not about to relinquish real control to younger hands. The preliminary examination was conducted with the careful precision of a spider examining a fly. Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching, fishing for admissions that could be used in the formal proceedings to come. But Jesus' response cut straight through the pretense. I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. The answer was perfectly reasonable and utterly legal under Jewish law. A defendant could not be compelled to testify against himself. Yet one of the guards, offended by what he perceived as disrespect, struck Jesus across the straw. Face. The sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the chamber, a preview of the violence to come. Is that how you answer the high priest? The guard demanded. Jesus' response revealed the careful balance he maintained even under interrogation. If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Even in the face of injustice, he appealed to justice. Even when receiving violence, he responded with reason. From Annas, Jesus was sent bound to Caiaphas, where the full Sanhedrin had been hastily assembled in the pre-dawn hours. This was the supreme court of Judaism, composed of 71 of the most learned religious authorities in the nation. Under normal circumstances, they were careful deliberators who weighed evidence with scholarly precision. But these were not normal circumstances. The challenge they faced was significant. They needed grounds for execution that would satisfy both Jewish law and Roman requirements. False witnesses were brought forward, but their testimonies contradicted each other in ways that revealed their fabrication. Under Jewish law, the death penalty required the agreement of at least 2 witnesses, and these witnesses had to agree in every detail. The conspiracy was crumbling under the weight of its own dishonesty. Finally, in desperation, Caiaphas himself rose and addressed Jesus directly. Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? When Jesus remained silent, the high priest played his final card, invoking the most solemn oath in Jewish culture. "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." The moment hung suspended between heaven and earth. Jesus could have remained silent, could have evaded the question, could have found a way to avoid the trap that was being set. Instead, he chose truth over safety, clarity over cleverness. "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The words shattered the tense silence like thunder. Caiaphas tore his robes, a dramatic gesture, expressing horror at what he considered ultimate blasphemy. "He has uttered blasphemy," he declared. "What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy." The verdict was swift and unanimous. He deserves death. But there was a problem. Under Roman law, the Jewish authorities could not carry out capital punishment. They could condemn, but they could not execute. For that, they needed Roman approval, which meant they needed to present their case to Pontius Pilate, the fifth prefect of Judea. Dawn was breaking over Jerusalem as they led Jesus through the streets to the Praetorium, Pilate's official residence. The irony was bitter. The religious leaders, who demanded his death, refused to enter the Roman headquarters because it would make them ceremonially unclean for Passover. They were scrupulous about ritual purity while orchestrating judicial murder. Pilate, dragged from his morning routine to deal with what he assumed was another local religious squabble, quickly found himself in a situation far more complex than he had anticipated. The man standing before him hardly looked like a dangerous revolutionary. Beaten and bruised from the night's proceedings, Jesus nonetheless maintained a dignity that impressed even the Roman governor. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked, cutting straight to the heart of the political charges that had been laid. The question was crucial. If Jesus claimed to be a king, he would be guilty of treason against Caesar, a crime that demanded death. Jesus' response revealed the deeper nature of his kingdom. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." This was a kingship unlike any Pilate had, encountered one that conquered through love rather than force, that gained power through service rather than domination. Pilate found himself in an impossible position. 3 times he declared Jesus is innocent, finding no fault that warranted death. His wife sent word of troubling dreams that warned against harming this righteous man. Every instinct told him that executing Jesus would be a miscarriage of justice. Yet the crowd outside grew more agitated, and the Jewish leaders played their trump card. "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." The threat was clear and politically devastating. Pilate's position as prefect depended entirely on Caesar's favor. Any suggestion that he was soft on treason would reach Rome's ears within weeks. When the crowd began to shout, "We have no king but Caesar," words that must have tasted like ash in Jewish mouths, Pilate made his fateful decision. But first came the symbolic washing of hands, a gesture that satisfied no one and changed nothing. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. Transferring responsibility he could not actually shed. The crowd's response would echo through history. "His blood be on us and on our children," words that would tragically fuel centuries of persecution. The sentence was crucifixion, Rome's most brutal form of execution, reserved for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state. It was designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to serve as a deterrent so horrific that few would dare challenge imperial authority. The condemned would hang naked on wooden beams, dying slowly from exposure, exhaustion, and asphyxiation, while crowds mocked their suffering. Jesus was handed over to the execution squad. 4 Roman soldiers practiced in the grim efficiency of state-sponsored death. They stripped him of his clothes and dressed him in a scarlet military cloak, mockingly investing him with royal regalia. A crown was fashioned from thorns and pressed into his scalp, drawing blood that mixed with the bruises from the knight's beatings. A reed was placed in his hand as a scepter, and the soldiers genuflected in savage parody, "Hail, King of the Jews!" When they tired of their game, they stripped off the cloak and clothed him in his own garments for the final journey. The horizontal beam of the cross, weighing perhaps 75 to 100 pounds, was laid across his shoulders. The procession to Golgotha began, winding through Jerusalem's narrow streets while curious onlookers gathered to witness another of Rome's public executions. But Jesus, weakened by the sleepless night, the beatings, and the scourging, stumbled under the weight of the timber. Simon of Cyrene, a Jewish pilgrim from North Africa who had come to Jerusalem for Passover, was pressed into service. The Roman soldiers simply grabbed this unfortunate man from the crowd and forced him to carry the instrument of another man's death. Picture Simon's confusion and fear as the heavy beam was thrust upon his shoulders. He had come to celebrate God's deliverance of his ancestors from Egypt, only to find himself carrying the cross on which God's Son would die. His sons, Alexander and Rufus, would later become known in the early Christian community, growing up with the extraordinary heritage of a father who had literally carried the cross of Christ. Golgotha, the place of the skull, lay just outside Jerusalem's walls, as Jewish law required. It may have been called this because of its skull-like appearance, or perhaps because it was a regular place of execution where skulls and bones were scattered. Here, in this place of death, the cosmic drama reached its climax. The execution squad worked with professional efficiency. Jesus was stripped naked, the final humiliation in a process designed to destroy human dignity. His hands and feet were nailed to the wood, the iron spikes driven through flesh and sinew into the timber beneath. The cross was raised and dropped into its socket with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves of agony through his already tortured body. Above his head, Pilate had ordered a sign to be placed, a titulus, written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, the three languages of the ancient world: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The Jewish leaders protested, demanding that it read, "This man said, 'I am King of the Jews,'" but Pilate refused to change it. "What I have written, he declared, unknowingly proclaiming a truth that transcended his political cynicism. The soldiers divided his garments among themselves, gambling for his seamless tunic, a detail that fulfilled ancient prophecy, while revealing the casual cruelty of those who made their living from death. To them, this was just another execution, another day's work. They had no idea they were presiding over the central event of human history. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the land. This was no eclipse impossible during Passover's full moon, but creation itself, mourning the suffering of its creator. In this supernatural darkness, Jesus spoke 7 times, each utterance revealing something profound about the nature of divine love and human redemption. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Words of grace spoken over the very ones who were killing him. To the repentant thief crucified beside him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." The promise of immediate salvation to one who had lived a life of crime, but died with faith. To his mother and beloved disciple, "Woman, behold your son, behold your mother," ensuring that human relationships and responsibilities were maintained even in the midst of cosmic events. Then came the cry that revealed the full horror of what was taking place. My God, why have you forsaken me?" This was not merely physical agony, but spiritual anguish beyond human comprehension. The One, who had existed in perfect fellowship with the Father throughout eternity, was experiencing separation, bearing the weight of all human sin and suffering, the punishment it deserved. "I thirst," the fountain of living water experiencing human need. the one who had promised that those who came to him would never thirst again now, knowing thirst in its most profound form. Sour wine was offered on a hyssop branch, the same plant used to mark doorposts during the first Passover in Egypt, when the angel of death passed over houses marked with lamb's blood. Finally, with strength that surprised the hardened soldiers, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "It is finished." The Greek word tetelestai was used in commercial transactions to mean paid in full, stamped on receipts when debts had been completely satisfied. The price of human redemption had been paid. The work of salvation was complete. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And with these words, he bowed his head and died. Not the passive death of a victim, but the active surrender of one who had the power to lay down his life and the authority to take it up again. The earth convulsed in response. Earthquakes shook the region, tombs split open, and in the temple, the massive veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary tore from top to bottom divine hands, ripping apart the barrier between heaven and earth that had existed since Eden. A Roman centurion, a pagan career soldier who had witnessed countless executions, stood beneath the cross and made a confession that the religious establishment had rejected. Truly this man was the Son of God. In death, Jesus was receiving recognition that he had been denied in life. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin who had secretly believed in Jesus, found courage in crisis. He went to Pilate and requested the body, a dangerous act that publicly identified him as a follower of the executed criminal. Pilate, surprised that death had come so quickly, verified with the centurion before granting permission. Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, now acted in broad daylight, bringing 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, an enormous quantity of spices that showed both his wealth and his devotion. Together, these two unlikely disciples wrapped Jesus' body in linen cloths according to Jewish burial customs, and laid him in Joseph's new tomb, carved from solid rock in a garden near the place of execution. As the Sabbath began at sunset, a massive stone was rolled across the tomb's entrance. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee watched from a distance, noting where he was laid so they could return after the Sabbath to complete the burial preparations that had been interrupted by the approaching holy day. Death appeared to have won the ultimate victory. The light of the world had been extinguished. The word that had spoken creation into existence had fallen silent. Hope itself seemed to have died on that rough wooden cross outside Jerusalem's walls. But those who understood the deeper mysteries of divine love knew that this was not the end of the story. Death had done its worst, had thrown everything it possessed against the Son of God. Yet in that very act of destruction, it had sealed its own defeat. For the one who had died was not merely human, but the very author of life itself. And life, having submitted to death, was about to demonstrate which was truly stronger. The tomb was sealed, the guards were posted, the disciples were scattered, but Saturday's silence was pregnant with Sunday's promise. Death had destroyed itself in destroying death, and the greatest victory in cosmic history was less than 48 hours away. The first day of the week began like countless others, before it darkness slowly yielding to the pale promise of dawn over Jerusalem's ancient walls. But this Sunday morning would prove unlike any other in the history of the Rupile's world, for on this day death itself would die. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb while the stars still shone in the pre-dawn sky. She carried spices and oils, expecting to complete the burial preparations that had been hastily interrupted by the Sabbath's approach. Death was familiar territory to her. She had watched Jesus die, had seen his body taken down from the cross, had observed where Joseph of Arimathea laid him in the borrowed tomb. She came prepared to anoint a corpse, to perform the final acts of love that the living owe to the dead. But as she approached the garden tomb, Something was wrong. The massive stone that had sealed the entrance, requiring several strong men to move, stood displaced, not rolled aside with care, but thrust away as if by some tremendous force. The tomb, which should have been sealed and secure, gaped open in the growing light. Mary's first thought was grave robbery. In an age when tombs were often ransacked for their burial goods, this seemed the most logical explanation. She ran through the empty streets of Jerusalem, her heart pounding with a mixture of grief and outrage. When she found Peter and John, her words tumbled out in breathless anguish. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." The two disciples raced through the dawn-lit streets, their sandals slapping against stone as they hurried toward the garden. John, younger and faster, reached the tomb first, but hesitated at the entrance, peering into the shadowy interior. Peter, impetuous as always, arrived moments later and pushed past his companion into the tomb itself. What they found defied every explanation for grave robbery. The linen wrappings that had bound Jesus' body lay exactly in place, as if the body had simply evaporated from within them. The headcloth was folded separately, placed with the careful precision that spoke of deliberate action rather than hasty theft. No grave robber works with such methodical care. No thief leaves valuable burial spices untouched. John entered the tomb, saw the evidence, and believed, though he later admitted that they did not yet understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Faith sometimes precedes understanding. Recognition sometimes comes before comprehension. Something had happened here that shattered every category of normal experience. The disciples returned to their lodging, but Mary remained at the tomb, weeping. Grief has its own momentum, its own need to be expressed even when hope begins to stir. As she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb once more, and saw what Peter and John had not seen. Two angels in white sat where Jesus' body had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. "Woman, why are you weeping?" they asked with the gentle concern that heavenly messengers show for human sorrow. Mary's answer revealed her single-minded focus. "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid." Even surrounded by supernatural presences, she thought only of finding the body of the one she loved. She turned away from the tomb and found herself face to face with a figure she took to be the gardener. In the half-light of early morning, through eyes blurred with tears, this mistake was understandable. Yet in a deeper sense, her identification was perfect, for this was indeed the gardener of the new creation, the one who would plant the seeds of eternal life in hearts across the world. "Woman, why are you weeping?" the figure asked, echoing the angel's question. "Whom are you seeking?" Mary, still convinced she was speaking to the garden's keeper, made her desperate plea. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Then he spoke her name, Mary. That single word, spoken with a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat, shattered her misconception like light destroying darkness. Recognition flooded through her like sunrise after the longest night. This was not the gardener, not some stranger who might have moved a body. This was Jesus himself, alive, breathing, speaking her name with the same love that had once cast 7 demons from her tormented soul. "Rabboni!" she cried, an Aramaic term of deep respect and affection that meant "my teacher." She reached out to embrace him, to hold on to this impossible reality with physical touch that would confirm what her eyes could hardly believe. But Jesus gently stopped her. "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." There was a new relationship to be established, a new way of knowing him that would transcend physical presence. The resurrection body was real but different, glorified yet recognizable, physical yet transformed. Mary ran to the disciples with news that must have sounded like the ravings of grief-stricken. "Imagination! I have seen the Lord." She told them what he had said, but grief and disbelief made poor companions for faith. The testimony of women was not legally recognized in that culture, and the disciples struggled to accept what their theology had not prepared them to expect. That evening, as the disciples huddled behind locked doors, fear of the Jewish authorities binding them tighter than any bolt or bar, Jesus appeared among them. Not through the doors, not with dramatic entrance, but simply present in their midst as if he had always been there. The room that had been closed became open. The hearts that had been fearful became wondering. "Peace be with you," he said, words that carried more than greeting, more than comfort. This was the peace that passes understanding, the peace that comes when death itself has been defeated and fear has lost its ultimate weapon. When he showed them his hands and his side, the scars of crucifixion, visible in his glorified body, wondering gave way to joy. Death had not erased those marks, but had transformed them into trophies of victory. "Peace be with you," he said again, and then came the commissioning that would change the world. "As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." The mission that had brought him from heaven to earth was now being extended through them to every corner of creation. When he breathed on them, the very word used in Genesis when God breathed life into Adam, they received the Holy Spirit, and with it the authority to forgive and retain sins. But Thomas, called the twin, had been absent that night. When the others told him what they had experienced, his response became the voice of honest doubt. "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." His skepticism was not cynicism, but the careful caution of one who refused to build hope on foundation that might crumble. 8 days later, the disciples were again gathered, this time with Thomas present. The doors were locked, the atmosphere tense with expectation and doubt in equal measure. Once again, Jesus appeared among them with the same greeting, "Peace be with you." But this time, he addressed Thomas directly, accommodating honest doubt with patient grace. "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." The invitation was tender, the tone understanding rather than condemning. Jesus did not rebuke Thomas for his doubt, but provided exactly the evidence he needed for faith to take root. Thomas's response exceeded every other confession in the Gospels. "My Lord and my God." The doubter became the first to recognize not just the resurrection, but the full divinity of the risen Christ. His words echoed the opening of John's Gospel. The Word who was God had indeed become flesh, had died, and had risen in triumph over death itself. Yet Jesus' next words extended blessing beyond the privileged few who had seen with their own eyes. "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." This blessing reaches across the centuries to every person who would come to faith through testimony rather than sight, through witness rather than personal encounter with the risen Christ. But the story was not complete. Days later, 7 of the disciples found themselves back in Galilee, drawn perhaps by the familiar comfort of old routines in the face of new realities they could barely comprehend. Peter announced his intention to go fishing, and the others joined him, not necessarily abandoning their calling, but returning to what they knew while they processed what they had experienced. Through the night they worked the waters they knew so well, casting nets with the practiced skill of men who had spent their lives on the Sea of Galilee. But the nets came up empty, again and again, echoing the futility they had experienced 3 years earlier before Jesus first called them from these same waters. As dawn broke over the lake, a figure appeared on the shore, too distant to identify but close enough to call across the water. "Children, do you have any fish?" The answer came back with the weight of disappointment. "No." The stranger's suggestion seemed almost insulting to professional fishermen. Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps hope, perhaps simple courtesy. But they cast the net as instructed. Immediately, the water exploded with fish, so many that the net could barely contain them. The catch was so extraordinary that they could not haul it into the boat, but had to drag it behind them to shore. John, with the insight that love sharpens, was first to understand, it is the Lord. Peter, true to his impetuous nature, clothed himself. He had been working naked in the boat and plunged into the water, swimming the 100 yards to shore with powerful strokes that carried him toward the one he loved more than life itself. On the beach, Jesus had prepared breakfast bread and fish cooking over a charcoal fire, the same type of fire where Peter had warmed himself during his denial, where he had 3 times claimed not to know the man who now invited him to share a meal. The smell of charcoal smoke must have triggered painful memories, yet Jesus was about to transform those memories into something redemptive. They ate in silence, no one daring to ask, "Who are you?" because they knew, yet somehow the knowing was deeper now than mere recognition. This was Jesus, yet Jesus transformed, glorified, somehow more fully himself than he had been even before his death. When the meal was finished, Jesus turned to Peter with a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" The use of Peter's original name, Simon, was significant. This was about fundamental identity, not just apostolic calling. The question itself echoed Peter's earlier boast that even if all others fell away, he would remain faithful. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you," Peter replied, using a different Greek word for love than Jesus had used, perhaps unable to claim the highest form of love after his failure, or perhaps distinguishing between the love he felt and the love he aspired to show. "Feed my lambs," Jesus responded, commissioning him to pastoral care. Twice more the question came, each time Peter affirming his love, each time receiving commission to tend and feed the sheep entrusted to his care. The threefold questioning matched the threefold denial, replacement covering transgression, restoration, erasing condemnation. But the final exchange carried deeper implications. The third time, Jesus used the same word for love that Peter had been using, meeting him where he was rather than demanding more than he could. Claim, Peter, grieved that Jesus asked him a third time, made his final appeal to divine omniscience. "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," came the final commissioning, followed by prophecy of Peter's future martyrdom. "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." The prediction was both warning and comfort warning of suffering to come, comfort that such suffering would serve divine purpose. The Gospel of John concludes with humble acknowledgement of its own limitations. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. The hyperbole is beautiful in its recognition that no finite account could capture the infinite reality of who Jesus was and what he accomplished. Yet what has been written is sufficient for its purpose. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. From the cosmic prologue about the Word who was God to this final invitation to believe and receive life, John's Gospel has traced the arc of divine love from eternity through history and back to eternity. The garden of new creation has been planted. The seeds of eternal life have been sown in the soil of human history. What began with "in the beginning" was the Word, concludes with the promise that all who believe may have life in his name. The Word has become flesh, has died, has risen, and now lives forever to offer life to all who will receive it. The tomb is empty, the grave clothes lie undisturbed, and death itself has been swallowed up in victory. The morning of new creation has dawned, and its light will never fade. The charcoal fire crackled on the shore of Galilee as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and gold. It was a simple, seen driftwood burning on a beach, bread warming on the stones, fish cooking over the flames, yet it contained within it the profound mystery of resurrection life intersecting with ordinary human existence. Jesus stood beside the fire. He had kindled, the creator of combustion tending flames with the same hands that bore the nail scars of crucifixion. The one who had fed 5,000 with a boy's lunch now prepared breakfast for 7 exhausted fishermen who had worked through the night with nothing to show for their efforts except wet nets and empty hearts. Picture the disciples as they dragged their boat onto the familiar shore, their emotions a complex mixture of wonder and bewilderment. This was their 3rd recorded encounter with the risen Christ, yet each meeting seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. The Jesus they had known for 3 years was unmistakably present, yet he was somehow more than he had been glorified, transformed, operating according to laws that transcended their understanding. Peter had swum to shore ahead of the others, his impetuous love overcoming the awkwardness that might have held him back. The man who had denied knowing Jesus now could not bear to remain separated from him by even 100 yards of water. As he stood dripping beside the fire, did he remember another charcoal fire where he had warmed himself while rejecting any connection to the man now standing before him? The other disciples followed more slowly, hauling behind them the net that bulged with exactly 153 large fish. The precision of that number has puzzled readers for centuries. Why not many fish or a great catch? The specificity suggests eyewitness memory, the kind of detail that remains vivid when everything else has faded. Someone counted those fish, perhaps in the amazement of the moment, perhaps in the aftermath of wonder. "Come and have breakfast," Jesus said, his words carrying the weight of invitation into something far grander than a morning meal. This was communion in its deepest sense, the sharing of food that creates and celebrates relationship, the breaking of bread that has bound human communities together since the dawn of civilization. The disciples came forward, but John notes that none dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew, yet their knowledge had been transformed by his resurrection. This was Jesus, but Jesus, as they had never known him, familiar yet mysterious, recognizable yet transcendent. He served them bread and fish with the same hands that had blessed the loaves and fishes on the hillside, the same hands that had broken bread in the upper room, the same hands that had been pierced with nails on Golgotha. The breakfast proceeded in relative silence, each participant lost in contemplation of what it meant to share a meal with someone who had died and returned to life. The fish was real, the bread substantial, the fire warm against the cool morning air. Yet, everything was charged with significance that ordinary experience could not contain. When the meal was finished and the disciples sat replete beside the dying fire, Jesus turned to the man who had once boasted of loyalty greater than any other. "Simon, son of John," he began, using the name that connected Peter to his origins, rather than the rock name that pointed toward his destiny. "Do you love me more than these?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications. More than these other disciples, these nets and boats that represented his former life? The comparison that had once seemed so important to Peter, his claim to superior devotion, was now laid bare for examination. "Yes, Lord," Peter replied, his voice perhaps softer than it had been in that upper room when he had declared his willingness to die for his master. "You know that I love you." The Greek words John recorded reveal a subtle distinction Jesus asked about agape, the highest form of kinds, divine love, while Peter responded with phileo, the warm affection of deep friendship. Perhaps Peter no longer trusted himself to claim the highest love after his failure in the courtyard of the high priest. "Feed my lambs," Jesus responded, commissioning restored failure into pastoral care. The one who called himself the Good Shepherd was entrusting his flock to an under-shepherd who had learned the cost of overconfidence and the grace of forgiveness. The second question came without the comparison. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Again, Peter affirmed his love. Again, using the word for friendship rather than divine love. Again, Jesus commissioned him, "Tend my sheep." The progression was deliberate, from feeding young lambs to tending the full flock, from nurture to leadership, from care to oversight. The third question must have pierced Peter's heart like a sword. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" This time, Jesus used Peter's own word, phileo, rather than agape, meeting him where he was rather than demanding more than he could claim. Yet the threefold repetition echoed the threefold denial, and Peter understood the weight of what was happening. "Lord, you know everything," he said, making his final appeal not to his own protestations, but to divine omniscience. "You know that I love you." It was both confession and surrender, both affirmation and acknowledgement of human limitation. If Jesus knew everything, then he knew both the depth of Peter's love and the weakness of Peter's flesh. "Feed my sheep," Jesus said for the third time, the commission now complete. 3 denials had been covered by 3 affirmations, 3 failures erased by 3 commissioning statements. The man who had been afraid to admit knowing Jesus was now entrusted with caring for his people. But there was more. Jesus continued with words that transformed Peter's future failures into prophecy of ultimate faithfulness. "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were desno, young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." The prediction was both gentle and stark. Peter would indeed die a martyr's death, his hands stretched out on a cross, as his Lord's had been. Tradition tells us that Peter, considering himself unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus, requested to be crucified upside down. The fisherman, who had once leaped into water to reach his Lord, would one day stretch out his hands in final surrender to the same kind of death Jesus had died. "Follow me," Jesus said, the same words with which he had first called Peter from his nets 3 years earlier. But now the meaning had deepened beyond simple discipleship to include ultimate sacrifice. Following Jesus meant not just walking behind him in ministry, but walking behind him even unto death. Peter's curiosity was immediately aroused by the sight of John, following them. "Lord, what about this man?" he asked, pointing to the beloved disciple. "It was such a human question. If I must die, what about him? If I must suffer, will he escape?" The comparison that had marked Peter's earlier boast now surfaced in his concern about relative destiny. Jesus' response revealed the danger of such comparisons. "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Each disciple's path would be unique, each calling specific to the individual. Peter's task was not to understand John's destiny, but to fulfill his own. John adds a fascinating footnote to this exchange, explaining that Jesus' hypothetical statement about him remaining until the Lord's return had been misunderstood by some in the early church to mean that John would never die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, John clarifies. "But if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" Even the beloved disciple had to correct misinterpretations of the Master's words. As this final recorded encounter drew to a close, John stepped back to offer a perspective on the entire gospel he had written. The man who had been present at the Transfiguration, who had leaned against Jesus' breast at the Last Supper, who had stood at the foot of the cross and peered into the empty tomb, now reflected on the impossibility of capturing in words the fullness of who Jesus was and what he had done. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, he wrote with the humility that comes from intimate knowledge. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. The hyperbole is beautiful in its recognition of infinity. No finite account could exhaust the reality of the infinite Christ. Yet John's purpose was not comprehensive biography, but selective testimony. These are written, he explained, so that you may believe that Jesus is the first, Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Every story had been chosen, every detail preserved, every word recorded for this single goal that readers might believing, might receive the gift of eternal life. From the cosmic prologue that declared the Word to be God, to this simple breakfast on a Galilean shore, John's Gospel had traced the arc of divine love entering human history. The Creator had become creature, the Word had become flesh, the Eternal had entered time. He had lived among us, died for us, and risen to offer us life that would never end. The fire on the beach had burned down to glowing embers, but the light kindled by that resurrection morning would burn forever. The disciples would soon return to Jerusalem to await the promised Spirit, and from there they would carry the message of life triumphant over death to the ends of the earth. The breakfast was ending, but the banquet it represented was eternal. In years to come, when Peter stood before hostile crowds in Jerusalem proclaiming the resurrection of the one they had crucified, he would draw strength from this morning's restoration. When John wrote these words from his exile on Patmos, he would remember not just the empty tomb, but this simple meal that proved the risen Christ was no mere spirit, but the same Jesus who had called them from their nets. The nets they had left behind to follow him had been filled once more, not with the catch of a night's fishing, but with the miraculous provision of divine grace. The breakfast they shared was more than food. It was communion with the living God who had conquered death and now offered life to all who would believe. As the sun rose higher over Galilee and the disciples prepared to return to Jerusalem, they carried with them not just the memory of this encounter, but the reality of the life that encounter represented. They had seen the Lord, had eaten with him, had been commissioned by him. The Word who had become flesh had died and risen, and in his rising had opened the way for all flesh to become word-living. Testimonies to the grace that transforms death into life, failure into faithfulness, fear into love. The gospel ends, but the story continues. Every reader who believes becomes part of the narrative. Every life transformed by faith becomes a chapter in the ongoing revelation of divine love. The breakfast on the shore was finished, but the banquet of forever had only just begun. And all who hunger and thirst for righteousness are invited to come and dine at the table, where the risen one still serves bread and fish with nail-scarred hands, where the love that conquered death continues to conquer hearts, where the Word made flesh continues to speak life into all who will listen. This is the gospel according to John, not just the record of what happened, but the invitation to join the story that will never end. The tomb is empty, the nets are full, and the table is set for all who will come and believe. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And that glory, first glimpsed by shepherds in Bethlehem's fields, and finally revealed in Joseph's empty tomb, continues to shine in every heart that opens to receive the light of the world. The story ends, but the life it offers goes on forever. This is the gospel good news that is not just about what happened then, but about what can happen now, in any heart that will believe.